Hello, welcome, Kulashib Kupla. I'm Pam Whitty. I live in Atlantic Canada, just across the ocean from you, and I live on the unceded, unsurrendered, and unpurchased territory of the Wolastoqey people. In 1725, the Peace and Friendship Treaties were signed by the British Crown with the Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey people for title over these lands and provision of rules for ongoing relations between nations. The non-Indigenous people, settlers such as myself and my ancestors, have not been very good at making sure that Indigenous people benefit from these treaties. The Indigenous resurgence taking place at this time is helping all of us to contribute more equitably to the place of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people on these territories. Sorry, for some reason that didn't go forward. So I've titled this presentation, Being Present to Literacies in the Everyday. I see that as a counter to phrases such as lost learning and catching up. Children are already caught up. They already know what they're doing. They are constantly making meaning in their lives about the literacies, their forms of communication and expression. It's really time for us to catch up to them and to recover our own lost learning about what they know and what we can learn with and from them. I'm going to give you two examples. I've been in early childhood for about 47 years as working in childcare and in schools, primary grades, and working in the university for the past 30 as an educator and also as a community action researcher. These two examples are from my very first year of being in a collective with young children in a childcare center. A bee flew in the window. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to help get the bee out. I didn't really know how to do that. And Hannah Grant knew. She was 4, and she told me what I needed to do and how I needed to do that. And it's a skill that she taught me that is a lifelong skill I have. So I learned that from a 4-year-old who was already quite knowledgeable in her own family literacies and the literacies of the world. Second short story I wanted to share with you as an example of how literacies occur in the everyday and show the competence and capabilities of children, that they already know things. It's from a research project I'm doing with a colleague on LGBTQ conversations with picture books and families. And a mom told us she was walking in the woods with her son, Jonathan, let's say, who told her at the beginning of the walk that he wanted to change his name to his second name. Let's say it's Azalea. And she asked him about that. And she said, well, is that just for our walk in the woods? Or is that forever? And he said, no, it's forever, Mom. I'm a girl. So these two children know themselves and have receptive audiences to share their knowledge and are being and becoming literate in their own and different ways. So where I live on Wolastoqey territory, there are competing paradigms of what it means to be literate and what literacies mean, what literatures mean. I'm going to give an example by going with simply one word, Wolastoq. Wolastoq is the name of this beautiful river here, and Wolastoq in Wolastoqey language means beautiful and bountiful. And the Wolastoqey people have lived along this river for about 12,000 years. 12,000 years, there have been children and families and all kinds of literacies and languages and literatures occurring before the Europeans came. When the Europeans came, Jacques Cartier sailed into what is now the Bay of Fundy, and he renamed the Wolastoq. He called it the Fleuve Saint-Jean, the St. John River. So if we just think for a moment about how different the language is. Wolastoq tells us about the river. It is beautiful. It's bountiful. It provides food. It provides transportation. St. John tells us about a saint, a Catholic saint, and it tells us about the patriarchy. And this gives a very small example using a single word about the two different and very competing paradigms on this territory. And So land as literacy and literacies of and from the land is a resurgent Indigenous way of being and knowing that's really coming forward at this moment in time in Canada. We have many research chairs who are speaking about Indigenous ways of knowing that have been ever present on this land, but have been also covered over, marginalized, made invisible. Sandra Steers is an Indigenous Mohawk scholar, also a Canada Research Chair, and she speaks about land itself as being an articulation of ancient knowledges grounded in the experience of self in relation to place, and not just the human self, but also the more than human self. When I look at the description of this research symposium, the idea of feeling grounded really resonated with me. I know that many of us, in terms of healing and feeling grounded, do rely on the outdoors. We go out of doors. For example, I will take a walk in Odell Park, where there are pine trees that are 200 to 300 years old, and they make me feel part of something larger. As the description for the symposium also points out, there have been many material, digital, and social inequities made visible because of COVID. One of the largest ones in Canada is the inequity between early learning and childcare and education. So education is a publicly funded, universally accessible system. Early learning and childcare, on the other hand, in most provinces and territories, is a privately funded system supported by parent fees and some government subsidies. When COVID began, childcare workers went home for a short time, but they were called back to work for being essential workers. So they have less materials than teachers, fewer digital affordances, and they are certainly paid less and are deemed less valuable in many ways, including their compensation. When the childcare educators came back to care with and for the children of the other essential workers, a lot of literacies took place in the outdoors. People went outside because it was safe, because it was interesting, and because they couldn't use all their materials inside. Many materials had to be put away. But prior to coming back, they had to learn digital literacies, which they didn't really use very much for the most part. I'm speaking about educators who we are working with in a national project, a national SHIRK project, and they said that the most critical thing for them when their childcare centers shut down is that families and children went home and their community dissolved, and they were like, how will we stay in touch? What are we going to do? So they relied heavily on digital literacies, knowing full well that many families didn't have access. Many educators took food to families. They took activities to families. They worked with whatever the devices the family had. But what came through loud and clear in this project, which is still ongoing and started pre-COVID, is this deep desire of educators to maintain connections and maintain community. When children returned to their centers, I would say that they were learning the literacies of social distancing, and it manifested itself in many ways, but I'll name a couple. One was this idea conveyed by this early childhood educator that we keep our distance now so that we will be able to gather together so no one will be missing. And this was particularly felt by young children who were removed from their grandparents. They couldn't go see their grandparents. Their grandparents couldn't come and see them. They were keeping each other safe. And so death is hovering around the edges of this particular capacity to attend to everyday literacies and to family and community relations. And also there are other examples, such as Brittany, who played with the children out on her playground when they were creating an ice cream stand. And when she got up to the stand to get her ice cream, they said, sorry, we're closed, shortage of supplies due to COVID. You have to go wait over there till we get organized. So she said, I went over there and I waited and I waited. And then finally they called me up and they made sure that I was socially distanced. So for me, that's really two very clear and different examples of how literacies manifest in the everyday, and how educators are truly listening to and constantly creating community with the children. And they always mentioned family and community. In this case, I have put up a powerful piece from Rebekah La Riviere, who is Métis living in Treaty 1. And she said for her, being an ECE at this moment during COVID, when so many inequities were being exposed, it was, how do we pay extra close attention to ourselves? How do we read ourselves and rewrite ourselves and dismantle this perpetuation of colonial narratives, both in our programs and with our children? So I think what she's talking about reminds me of this notion that Rachel Bryant, who is a literary historian, and who also lives in the territory where I live, and who is also a settler, she speaks about the ground beneath our feet having a history and identity that we as settlers have actively and anxiously hidden from ourselves. So this idea that there's two, she says, competing conceptualizations in our imaginations of a single geographic space: the colonized settled environments and the indigenous place worlds. So we're in the same space, however, we're in very different epistemological worlds. So I'm just going to give a short example of that. In 2010, as you can see here, I work at the university where there is a classroom we work with all the time, right across the hall. It has not been there for a year because the university's been closed. But being in the woods is really something early childhood does well. Being outdoors, literacy's outdoors, that really early childhood does that well and has for many years, many centuries. But we decided we would go into the woods, and that was a very different kind of literacy learning for the children and adults alike. Two things really stand out: becoming accustomed to being outdoors in the wood where the footing's uneven, where you can disappear quickly down a trail and lose everybody else. And the other part was this kind of sense of timelessness that occurs when you are in the woods. But you can see by the examples I have here that it's very present. It's what's going on in the moment. What's going on in the moment with a group of early learning and childcare educators with whom we've worked since about 2005. This is Under One Sky. Their center's right on the Wolastoqey River. And this is fiddlehead picking, which I see as a really embedded historical literacy of the land. You can see them with their baskets. They've been picking. They've got all the kids with them. It's the whole community. So I hope those two very small and brief examples show you the difference between the epistemologies of settlers and indigenous, not to dichotomize too much, but we are typically as settlers missing the history. So I see I'm almost out of time here, so I'm going to just move along. One of the literacies in Fiddleheads is that these are fiddleheads that were not picked. So you have to leave enough for 7 generations. So that is answering this big question that Daniel Heath Justice, a Cree scholar, asks: how do we become good ancestors? He suggests we need bigger questions in order to live at this moment on this planet, to be human, to behave as good relations, to learn to live together. And I will close with the idea that we have many, 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 many stories that are untold in our homes and our schools and our early learning and childcare centers. But we have an abundance of publication of Indigenous books that we can share with children and adults alike. And also Black Lives Matter, which made visible these incredible inequities. Talking with children with books allows them to bring things forward that are not personal to them, but may be embedded in what they're going through. And mental health is a really large issue coming out of COVID here in Canada. So I'm going to close with Rosie Berdoity, We who are not one and the same, but are in this convergence together. She's talking about being in COVID together, about the planetary crisis that we are in. I want to just return to children. Being literate changes over time and place. Children are always contributing to this, and it's important that we listen. This is from Cree scholar Margot Greenwood. She has aspirational goals that all of our children be rich with diversity and free from oppression. That was pretty fast. I'm a little over time. Woliwin, thank you. Hopefully I will get a chance to talk with you at the panel.